Episode number 3 is going to be so much fun. I bet that anytime you have an opportunity to learn the meaning or significance of your name, your ears perk up. Mine do. Instinctively, we know something is behind names. In fact, one could even argue that it's supernatural. Welcome to Unveiled Life and Godliness, the show where we explore next level living and pull back the veil to the beautiful and miraculous within the day-to-day through a God-infused life. This is a podcast of Paola Lane Magazine. Get ready for insightful conversations, real-life examples and stories, interesting interviews, and actionable tips to take you to the next level. I'm your host, Laura Prather, and the founder and editor of Paola Lane Magazine, and I'm thrilled to have you on this journey with me. If names are not correct, language will not be in accordance with the truth of things. A quote by Confucius. Okay, I've got my coffee, my dishwasher's on pause, and hopefully my dog is sleeping. I'm ready to go. This is Laura Prather, your host for Unveiled. I am the founder and editor of Paola Lane Magazine, and today we are talking about the power of a name. So I don't know about you. I think most kids run into this, but I used to hate my name. And I'm pretty sure that is pretty normal for most youngsters because, honestly, we're seeking to learn who we are. And we know instinctively that our name is a reflection of who we are. I wanted a pretty name like Aurora. That was really popular for me back in the 70s, and I thought Laura was so plain and boring. I've since come to love my name, and its meaning is victorious one, and that meaning really does carry something deeply and personally significant for me. It is something that I clung to in the darkest days of my past, and I hold on to it like a promise even to this day. But sometimes we put considerable thought into naming our children, businesses, projects, and pets. Sometimes we don't. And other times, that naming seems random. Oh, this sounds good, and we just name it. But either way, I've come to firmly believe in the power and prophetic nature of a name. Even when we don't necessarily put a lot of thought into a name, usually, I believe that we're really guided to give a name to a person. Now, that's not always the case. I know I've heard of instances where children were named out of spite, and they were given horrible names. However, I think there's a redeeming factor in that. And I'm not really qualified to go into that, so I won't. But what I do want to talk about is, again, that I personally believe in the power and prophetic nature of a name. So, for example, when we got our dog, he is a Boston Terrier Chihuahua. He's just a little thing. When we got him as a puppy, we considered different names, and, nothing really seemed to fit. And I think that's the way with a lot of things. We'll look at something and names just don't seem to fit, whether it's, like I said, a business or a pet or a child, until we come across one and it fits, and then that kind of sticks. And that was the case for our puppy. And we got it because I'm a huge fan of Tolkien, Lord of the Rings, Hobbit, whatever. And so I thought of the two dwarf names from the movie The Hobbit, Keely and Feely, the two warrior brothers. And they're tough, fierce, diminutive warriors. I didn't think of that. All I was thinking of, there's two dwarves, Keely and Feely. They're fun names. My dog is really little, and I ended up on the name Keely, and that was the one that seemed to fit him more than Feely. Feely didn't seem right, so we named him Keely. And It wasn't until a few weeks later that I decided to look up the meaning of the name and learned it meant little terror. And I was like, oh my goodness, what have I done? And I wish I had picked a different name, and I even thought about changing it, but it just seemed to fit this little puppy. And that is exactly what he became. He became a little terror. He absolutely controls our neighborhood. He's aggressive towards dogs and cars. All of our neighbors know that if they see us, they turn around and go the other way. It doesn't matter how big their dogs are. That's just who Keely is. And that had me ask the question, so were we drawn to the name because that's the kind of personality our dog had, or did he become his name? And that's a really good question. That's great for those of you who love to philosophize. Take that question and go deep with it and see what you all come up with. But that is not what I'm going to discuss today. But let me give you another example. And we're going to go back to my magazine, Paola Lane. So remember in episode 2, and if you haven't listened to that one, you go back and listen. But I shared how God directed me to the story of the jar of oil. And the widow woman. Along with that, I began to write out and hold close to me verses and thoughts on starting small. Verses such as, don't despise the day of small beginnings, and though your beginnings were small, your future will be very great indeed. And I didn't write the references down here in front of me, but I will put those in the description for you. But in 2019, we left my home state of Colorado and moved into our lake house in Missouri. And we landed on a street named Paola. Even though it had been a few years, I was still clinging to that story of the jar of oil and that widow woman and my small verses. That all happened back in 2016. So this is 3 years later in 2019. We leave where I was. We're now in Missouri. And I was still doing the business that I didn't really want to be doing. It's the business I talked about in episode 2. But I knew, one, that's what I needed to be doing. And I knew that something else was coming. In early 2021, I could feel it. It was really close. So in faith, I started letting my clients go in anticipation for this next step. And as part of that step of faith, I started a blog called Paola Lane, which is the name of our street. After some time of living on Paola Lane, it finally occurred to me to actually look up the name. And can you guess what it means? Yep, it means small. I do not believe in coincidences. That's not who I am. I believe in the prophetic and the supernatural. And so I giggled to myself because God never ceases to amaze me. Even in my ignorance, God was using the power of the prophetic and the nature of names to reinforce and guide my steps. So as a side note here, the Bible is totally filled to the brim with examples of the prophetic nature of names. And that is a really interesting study. Just open up your Bible and start at the beginning. You can start anywhere because pretty much every book of the Bible probably has an example of the power and the prophetic nature of names and how important names are to God. Okay, so let's go get back to where I was. It was shortly after I looked up the meaning of Paola Lane that I really felt God whisper in my heart to start something. It was the beginnings of the magazine. I wasn't quite sure what it was. I even remember, because I still have the notepad, I wrote down the word magazine with a question mark. But to me, it was so far-fetched that it was okay, whatever, I'll just write it down. And it took, that's a whole nother story. So maybe I'll do that another time. But at one point, I wrote this down. Paola Lane, a place where small beginnings lead to endless possibilities. You can turn to the back cover of any of my magazines and you will see that printed on the back, along with Job 8:7, which says, though your beginnings were small, your future will be very great indeed. That's really the cornerstone, the foundation of Paola Lane magazine. Anyway, I don't think I really understood the importance of names up until that point. Until then, it was more of an object of my curiosity, but now I was seeing the power of it, and I started to research the names of people I knew, their first and middle names, to come up with descriptive names of them. You know how the Native Americans have yeah, I can't think of anything. They have descriptive names. It's like one who shot the bird, or or something like that. Please, I don't want any disrespect, but you guys, the Native Americans have a beautiful way of naming their people. I've always admired it. So some of the results I came up with after researching the meanings of their names and then praying over them and putting that together were God's devoted warrior, Lady of Wisdom by the lake, God's pearl of delight. Those are just some of those that I had. And it took some time to do that research and then ask God to pull the meanings together. There were some names that I tried to research and I just didn't get much out of it. And if I'm honest, I really think it's because it wasn't time for me to understand. It wasn't for me to know. But I will say this, it gave me a much deeper understanding into the people in my life and myself. It was a revelation of our calling, of how God sees us. It does require some listening prayer to bring the names together. So, for example, my son's name means a gift devoted to God and brave warrior. As I prayed over these names, it was brought together and I clearly heard God's devoted warrior. So that's how I got his name. He doesn't always reflect that externally as he can't see himself in that way yet. But I regularly remind him that is where he's going. And it also reminds me that's where he is going, because it can be easy to think, oh, our kids aren't doing what we would expect them to do. And, that's a whole nother subject. But for me, I'm like, no, I know where he's going. I'm just going to speak into that. I'm going to speak life into him. His name reminds me of where he's going so that I can speak the kind of encouragement and feedback that will point him in that direction. In fact, I did it for myself, and I wasn't going to share this at first, but I think I will now, because it was such a, it was so meaningful to me. So I don't know how to explain this to you. So when I was a little girl, I read a book called The Tower of Gabura, and there was a character in there called Chokmah, and her name was Wisdom. And I actually referenced that story in issue number 2 of my magazine, and it's called Hidden Spaces. And I tell the story of Chokmah and what that meant to me. So go back, and if you want to get issue number 2, you can read that story. But wisdom has always been important to me from the time I was a really little girl. And I just always prayed that I would be a wise person, that I would have a pure heart. That's just always been my heart's desire. Now, believing that I was actually someone who was wise is a completely different thing, because if you look at my life and the stuff I went through, you would think that is the last thing that applies to me. But when I started to research the meanings of my first and middle name, keep in mind I had just moved here to Missouri. We had a lake house on Table Rock Lake. We had just come from Colorado. I was born in Wyoming, grew up in Colorado. I was a mountain girl, but now all of a sudden I was a lake girl, and my grandmother is actually from Missouri. So in a way, I was coming back to my roots, and the story of how we got here is actually supernatural. I will tell you that sometime as well. But we were here because we felt God told us to come here, and we didn't know anybody. But anyway, as I looked up my name, the meaning of my name was Lady of Wisdom by the Lake. And I just teared up. I was so overwhelmed because the meaning of that was so special to me. There's no way that could have been a coincidence. And I knew it was a really special gift from God. And I knew that my name was ordained for me from before the foundations of the earth. Words and names are so powerful and prophetic. So let's go back to my friend. When my friend gets discouraged, I sometimes remind her that she is God's pearl of delight, and that always brightens her day. And it helps me if I ever get frustrated with her or she's frustrated with herself to remind us that, hey, she is a pearl and she is a person of delight. And that when I told her that was the name, when I put her names together, and that was the combination that I got out of times of prayer. It was also very special for her as well because the pearl had a deep meaning to her. And like I said, I just want to encourage you guys to go and look up the meaning of your name and the names of those that God puts on your heart, because it will change your perspective of yourself and of them. Meditate and listen as the Holy Spirit helps you bring these meanings together. So, go out, research the different meanings of your first name and your middle name. There's lots of different resources. I recommend looking at a lot of different sources, and there will be, each place can have maybe different meanings, but when you take your time, there will be certain meanings that pop out and you're like, that one's for me. You will know which meaning is either purposed for you or if you're doing this for another person. And if you're not finding much, or maybe it makes you cringe, it just might be, let's say that again. It just might not be the right time for you or the other person to understand. And you know what? That's okay. There is one person I personally tried doing, but it wasn't flowing. I didn't find anything. So I understood that it wasn't for me to know. And, I just moved on. That's fine. So if you try this exercise and come up with a descriptive name, I would love to hear about it if you want to share it. If so, you can pop me an email. You'll find my email in the description box for this episode, or you can go to paolalane.com/003. And you can find my contact information there as well. I really would love to hear what you uncover. As we close this discussion, it reminds me of what God says in the book of Ephesians, the first chapter, that He knew us before the foundations of the world. I used to live at the base of Pikes Peak when we lived in Colorado Springs on the west side. And when I started meditating on Ephesians 1, I looked up at the mountain and thought, before this mountain was here, God thought of me. He gave me a name. He wrote out my life in a book. And it was so powerful. I realized He had a good story for me. I just needed to understand what He designed for me. I needed to understand my name so that I could come in alignment with that. Because His story, what He has written about me, what He's written about you, is far greater than the story that we can try to create for ourselves. Especially me, I tried to create a life that didn't happen. I made a mess of it, honestly, but He's redeemed that. Interesting enough, when I came into this revelation, it was around the same time period that I was learning to use what I did have in my hand that I referenced back in episode 2. And all of this was a result of seeking God in a deeper way during a time of desperation, which was a year before all of this. And I adopted the verse Matthew 6:33. Which I will read it out of my Bible right now. It says, "But seek first His kingdom and His righteousness, and all these things shall be added to you." And actually, I opened up my Bible today to read this to you guys, and right next to this verse, it says 2015. This became my life verse, and it was in 2016 that I talked about in episode number 2 that I learned to look at what was in my hand. And it was also in 2016 that I started praying Ephesians 1. And so that all came out of this result of learning to seek God. And it didn't take long for God to start unveiling a whole new world to me. And that unveiling led to a radically different life. Before I wrap up, I have a very special freebie exclusively for my podcast listeners. It's a free digital copy of my very first magazine issue, Number 1, for the beauty of the earth. It is still so impactful to me. I absolutely loved it, and I'm eager to share the digital copy with you. So head over to paolalane.com/read for free. There's no spaces in that. It's just read for free. Again, that's paolalane.com/read for free. And you will gain access to this exclusive bonus content for my podcast listeners. It's my way of saying thank you for being here and for your support. Okay, as we're tying this up, I knew I threw a lot out there today for you, but I pray that you really consider the power and the prophetic nature of even your name, and that you would spend some time asking God about what does your name mean and why did he give that to you. As I mentioned in today's podcast, Ephesians 1 became really critical to my transformation and really helped me in understanding the power and prophetic nature of names. I wrote out in Ephesians 1 in the first person back in 2016. I made a declaration and I prayed it every day for years. And I don't pray it every day anymore, but I do still pull it out and pray it. I have a copy of that declaration for you to download. If you go to paolalane.com/003, you can download it for free. And I encourage you to start praying that every day. And also start praying and asking God the meaning of your name. Your name is beautiful. Your story is amazing. And the story that God has written about you. And the thing I learned is I can try to write my own story, or I can come into alignment into the story that God designed and purposed for me. So praying for you today that you hear what your story is, that you see how beautiful and wonderful your name and your story are. All right, until next time, you have a beautiful day. Thank you for joining me today on Unveiled Life and Godliness. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to share it with a friend, subscribe, leave me a review, and remember, you can always visit my website at paolalane.com for more free content and to learn more about Paola Lane Magazine, as well as all the information and resources you need for the Unveiled podcast. Our podcast is published twice a month. And until next time, may your life become increasingly unveiled through God-infused living.